Stephen taught me something this morning, that when you need to fill some time, you just do a recap. So I'm going to do a recap of Genesis. We're in Genesis 43. So far, we have covered creation. We have covered trouble in the garden, the first family, Noah and the flood. We have covered the birth of the nations, Abraham and Lot, God's covenant, Abraham and Abimelech. We have covered Isaac and Rebekah, the fact that God's covenant is then passed on, blessings, Jacob and Esau, all those kind of things, and now we're finally up to Joseph. And if you recall last week, Joseph's brothers had to come to Egypt to pay him a visit. So what we're going to see tonight is, in God's time, his brothers are going to have to come pay him another visit. So if you would turn to Genesis chapter 43, and we're going to start in verse 1. I've really enjoyed being able to do this, and had a great conversation with Caleb here when he came in tonight, and just talking about all the great things that are in Genesis and how you can read it and then go read it again and pick up something different, and just, the things that you can learn through the book of Genesis. And as I have mentioned several times, the story of Joseph is absolutely my favorite story in the Bible. Just having this opportunity to spend the additional time in God's Word, making sure that I am prepared. As Stephen says, you read things differently when you're trying to prepare to teach from what you're reading versus when you just read through things. So it also coincides, I'm doing a Bible study right now on just, showing God through your work. And it's actually all following the story of Joseph, which I thought was good. Obviously Joseph showed God through all of his work. All right, so we'll go to Genesis 43. We will start in verse 1. And the famine was sore in the land. And it came to pass, when they had eaten up the corn which they had brought out of Egypt, their father said unto them, Go again, buy us a little food. All right, so when we left off last week, the 10 brothers had returned home, minus a brother. Simeon was left in Egypt. They told their father that, to come back and to get their brother, they would have to bring Benjamin. Benjamin being, the favorite in the family at this time. And if you recall, Jacob said, absolutely not. We're not doing that. So, we left this situation with, they have food. Oh, by the way, right, all their money was returned. So, none of them want to go back to Egypt at this point. Poor Simeon. But none of them want to go back to Egypt. Jacob doesn't want to send them back to Egypt. But keep in mind, none of them had any idea how long this famine was going to last, right? Nobody in Canaan knew what they knew in Egypt about the famine. All right, so, when we go back to the first trip, that occurred sometime in the first year of the famine, and they went and they got their food, knowing not that it was going to be, 6 more years of famine. And so, we're probably now into the second year of the famine, and it says that it was sore in the land. So things are getting worse, not better. And, Jacob probably thought when they came back that, they'd be able to ride out the famine. They had enough grain to get them through and to give them what they need, and everything would be all right. And again, poor Simeon, no plans to go back to Egypt and get Simeon. Just because he was so fearful of sending Benjamin on a trip into Egypt. But this famine is wearing on, and now we're to a point where the food that they got on their first trip is now run out. And so at this point now, we have Jacob coming to his sons, and out of a necessity, and we talked last week, necessity will drive us to do things we wouldn't normally do. So here we see Jacob, out of necessity, they're all going to starve to death at this point, is doing something that he had no intention of doing, that, he would not do under normal circumstances. And we can imagine that Jacob was, he was a godly man, right? Jacob was probably praying very hard for things like the famine to end, right? For them to be able to produce their own grain. I'm sure he was praying very hard and asking for God to send them relief. And sometimes when things don't happen in our time, Jacob may have gotten somewhat bitter or angry against God. because the prayers he was asking weren't being answered. But we know God had a plan, and this plan was going to lead to something much better for Jacob than he could have ever imagined in his wildest dreams. Basically at this point, Jacob is in Patience University, and God is waiting him out. And we'd mentioned last week, too, going back to Jacob and God wrestling, and the fact that God wasn't done wrestling with Jacob. And this is another time where we see God is pinning Jacob to the mat and getting Jacob to do what God wants him to do. So as we go on into verse 3, and we'll read through verse 5, and Judah spake unto him, saying, The man did solemnly protest unto us, saying, Ye shall not see my face, except your brother be with you. If thou wilt send our brother with us, we will go down and buy thee food. But if thou wilt not send him, we will not go down. For the man said unto us, Ye shall not see my face, except your brother be with you. So, Judah is stepping up into a leadership role amongst his brothers here. All right? He reminds Jacob what the warning was. All right? Now, again, none of them knew who this man was, the man who talked to them roughly, the man who, kept Simeon, bound him, and made that very visual display of binding him and taking him into custody. But not knowing he was Joseph, what he did remember was that he was a strong and fearsome person. All right? He was someone that they feared when they were there. He was someone that they feared having to go back and see. And what Judah knew was that he did not want to go back to Egypt without Benjamin. And so he reminded Jacob that Joseph told them that they could not see his face unless they brought back their youngest brother. And we'll see here in verse 6, And Israel said, Wherefore dealt ye so ill with me, as to tell the man whether ye had yet a brother? And they said, The man asked us straitly of our state and of our kindred, saying, Is your father yet alive? Have ye another brother? And we told him, According to the tenor of these words, could we certainly know that he would say, Bring your brother down. All right, so now I'm sure they've heard this many, many times since they returned. But, Jacob's going to bring it up again and rehash it. And why, oh, why did you tell him you had another brother? Why? Why did you tell him about Benjamin? And, again, he's desperate. He absolutely does not want to send Benjamin. And so, again, we see here where Jacob is not necessarily refusing, but he is protesting, right? And so, obviously, the brothers, they gave a logical explanation, all right? He was asking us questions. We didn't know what to expect. Have you ever been in a situation where you start getting questioned about something and you just kind of start saying things and you're like, why did I say that? Or why did I respond that way? Can you imagine standing before the second most important person in Egypt, begging for food, basically, and to have them to start asking you questions about your family? What would you do? Anybody here know anybody that talks too much? I know somebody that talks too much and would answer, give too detailed answers to questions. I get the opportunity at work sometimes to go to hearings through workers' compensation and whatever. And so when I go to hearings, or sometimes even with union things, when I get asked a question that I can answer yes or no, that's all they get out of me. I try to do nothing that incriminates myself, the company, whatever it is, right? So I get very guarded when people start asking me questions. But there are those people who do not get guarded when they get asked questions. Nancy, can you smack Jerry in the back of the head? I think he's nodding off. I'm just kidding, Jerry. Jerry told me he got a good nap last week, so I was just waiting for an opportunity to drop that one. Jerry's not sleeping. I'm kidding. Love you, Jerry. In case you didn't know, Jerry's he speaks roughly to me quite frequently, so that's what you get for being rough to the guy with a microphone, Jerry. Wow, I even forgot where I was. But, you know, people who just, you know, they give too much detail. And so that's what the brothers found themselves in that situation. They were shocked. They were getting asked very direct questions about their father, and, you know, they were actually asked if they had another brother. Well, you know, I do believe in answering questions honestly. So, you know, if I am asked a question, I will answer it honestly. But again, if I can answer it with a yes or a no, that's all I answer. But, you know, they told him that, and they're like, you know, how could we have possibly known that he was going to do what he did, right, and take Simeon and all the things that happened, and then tell us that we could not come back without Benjamin? How were we to know that that was the case? But it doesn't matter. You know, we have a desperate man here named Jacob who is like, why did you do that? Why have you done this to me? And in verse 8 through 10, and Judah said unto Israel, his father, so again, we see Judah here continuing to be this leader. Judah said unto Israel his father, send the lad with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and thou, and also our little ones. I will be surety for him, of my hand shalt thou require him. If I bring him not unto thee and set him before thee, then let me bear the blame forever. For except we had lingered, surely now we had returned this second time. All right, so we see Judah here. He steps forward again and tells us his father, you know, he's basically giving Jacob a guarantee, isn't he? But it's funny, right? He references Benjamin as a lad. He says, send the lad with me. How old do you think Benjamin is at this point? Late 20s, maybe early 30s. He's probably got kids of his own, yet they're still calling him a lad. And I think that's kind of, you know, I think it's a reference to the fact that he was the baby, right? He was the favorite. You know, I call Stephen baby boy all the time because, you know, he's the apple of his mother's eye. You know, so I feel like when they refer to him as a lad, he's a 30-year-old man. He's probably got a family. But it says, you know, send the lad with me. You know, now, direct translation, lad probably means youth or young man. But, you know, they says, send the lad with me. And he says, you know, I will give you a guarantee, right, a surety for him. So Judah is at this point putting his own life on the line, giving a guarantee to Jacob that if you let us take Benjamin, I will bring him back. Not guaranteeing he's bringing anyone else back, but he says, I will bring Benjamin back. And I find that funny. He doesn't say, you know, we will return with Benjamin. He says, I'll bring Benjamin back, and that's the guarantee. So, you know, this is a great thing that we're seeing Judah do, because if you remember, Judah on the other side of that, when they sold Joseph into slavery, was the one that said, yeah, let's not kill him. Let's make some money off of him, right? And, you know, he also, if you remember the one chapter there, he's the one that, you know, he did things with his daughter-in-law that he didn't know was his daughter-in-law, thought she was a harlot and all these things. So, you know, Judah doesn't have a good history up to this point. So we see Judah, you know, stepping up, working to do the right thing. You know, so what we continue to see here, right, is that, you know, all these things that they were doing to Joseph, you know, were meant to be bad, but, you know, all these things are what ultimately brings the Messiah. You know, at this point, God hadn't revealed which of the 12 sons of Jacob the Messiah was going to come from. We now know where that comes from. But it set up all these things. And we know that through all of this, you know, Satan, and again, as Stephen talked about Satan's power on earth, right? Satan hated the children of Jacob, and he hated what was going to become of them, what God was going to do with them, you know, and we still see that today, right? What Satan does to believers, you know, what the trials sometimes that we can go through. And you know, typically it seems like when, you know, something good happens, it's followed by something bad happening. And you know, we see that a lot. But, you know, we see that here. Judah is now stepping up, and we'll go to verse 11 through 14. And their father Israel said unto them, if it must be so, now do this. Take of the best fruits in the land, in your vessels, and carry down the man a present, a little balm and a little honey, spices and myrrh, nuts and almonds. And take double money in your hand, and the money that was brought again in the mouth of your sacks, carry it again in your hand. Peradventure, it was an oversight. Take also your brother, and arise, go again unto the man. And God Almighty give you mercy before the man, that he may send away your other brother and Benjamin. If I be bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. So, the Judah's guarantee has given a little bit of assurance to Jacob, and he now agrees. He agrees, you're going to do this, but you know what else you need to do? Let's give this man a present, okay? And the things that he was offering up as this present, and keep in mind, Jacob has a history of doing things with gifts, right? You remember in Genesis 33, the old plan to get an enemy to give him what he wanted. When he gave his brother, he cooked the meal for his brother and did those things and got the birthright. So, Jacob is using this plan again to give a gift, and also to take double money. The gift, the things that he was offering as the gift, almonds. Anybody like almonds? Almonds are pretty good. Honey, roasted almonds. Myrrh, spices. When he talks about the nuts, pistachios were things that they had in Canaan. I love a good pistachio. So he was offering all these things, and the things that he's telling them to take, were a delicacy in Egypt because these were things they didn't grow in Egypt. So, the gift he's offering here is a legitimate gift. And if you think about this time, we're in year 2 of a famine. Giving up these things would be a huge deal for Jacob's family because, these are things that they could use for food. So, he does that, and then he says, take double the money. All right? Take double the money and take the money that was sent back with us. All right? Now, a little bit of irony here. What was Joseph sold to the Ishmaelites for? 20 pieces of silver, right? We now have 10 brothers taking double the money. That's 20 units of money. And from everything I've read, money and silver are kind of interchangeable words in the text that we're looking at here. So, they are now taking the money to Joseph that he was sold for, basically. Which, I think was interesting, and you see those little pieces of irony there. And then, remember, again, Jacob, being a godly man, says that, he wishes them mercy, which is a good thing. But then, there's this little bit of, oh, woe is me, right? He says, if I am bereaved, I am bereaved. So he shows a little bit of faith, but then still, at the end of the day, he's like, oh, there probably none of them are going to come back, and I'll just die this lonely old man. So we see a little bit of faith, but he does agree now that they're going to go to Egypt. And that takes us to verse 15. And the men took that present, and they took double money in their hand, and Benjamin, and rose up and went down to Egypt, and stood before Joseph. And when Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the ruler of his house, bring these men home, and slay and make ready, for these men shall dine with me at noon. And the man did as Joseph bade, and the man brought the men into Joseph's house. And in verse 18, and the men were afraid because they were brought into Joseph's house, and they said, because of the money that was returned in our sacks at the first time are we brought in, that he may seek occasion against us and fall upon us and take us for bondmen and our asses. So, let's think about this, right? They're going back. They're already on high alert. They're afraid. They left. They brought back all of their money. Simeon's in prison. Can you imagine even going into this scenario where you've returned to Egypt, and the first thing that happens is you're taken to Joseph's house? There was no way ever that they could have possibly expected that they were going to end up in Joseph's house. All right? So Joseph tells his servant to take him to his home, to slaughter an animal, he says to slay, and make it ready, and prepare a meal, probably a feast. Probably not just a normal meal, probably a feast. And so, this is very unusual. Can you imagine that was Joseph doing this for anyone else that was coming from other lands to get grain? So very unusual. There's this unusual interest being paid in this family, and obviously loads of kindness, right? And so they must have wondered why. And what they wondered is, he's going to bring us in here and he's going to take us all and put us all in prison, or use us as slaves, or whatever it is. But what we see here is a picture of Jesus. All right? Jesus wants us to dine with him. He wants us to sup with him. He wants us to have that personal relationship. There's not much more personal thing that you can do with someone than to share a meal. Especially if it's a good meal. I like a good meal personally. But we see this, and if you want to turn to Revelation 3 and verse 20, we see this example here, right? In Revelation 3 verse 20, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come into him and will sup with him, and he with me. So we see this example through Joseph, right? It's about having them come in and share this meal. But again, they're fearful. They have no idea what to expect. They've traveled a long time. It didn't go well the first time that they came into Egypt. And so now they're here. They're in his house, not knowing what to expect, but the worst. And I would probably agree with them at this point. I would probably be expecting the worst to happen. So, is he bringing them in here to capture them and execute them, to imprison them, to use them as slaves? They don't know, but they are very, very suspicious of the situation they find themselves in. And so, they think proactively here, and they want to prepare for their meeting with Joseph. So in verse 19 through 23, we see, and they came near to the steward of Joseph's house, and they communed with him at the door of the house, and said, O sir, we came indeed down at the first time to buy food. And it came to pass, when we came to the inn, that we opened our sacks, and behold, every man's money was in the mouth of his sack, our money in full weight, and we have brought it again in our hand. And other money have we brought down in our hands to buy food. We cannot tell who put our money in our sacks. And this is the response that they get from the steward of Joseph's house. And he said, Peace be to you, fear not. Your God and the God of your father have given you treasure in your sacks. I had your money. And he brought Simeon out unto them. All right, so they're fearful. They start thinking that, how can we prepare and make sure that we can talk our way out of this. So they approach the steward of the house and they start telling him the story, right? Figuring it was the wise thing to do. Let's explain the situation now, because they're assuming that Joseph knows that they took their money. So all these things that they're doing, they want to get ahead of it. All right, so they want to explain this to the steward of Joseph's house, and tell him what happened, how they found the money in the sack when they got to the inn, and that they all had their money and all these things. And the steward's reply was definitely a shock to them when he said that, your God, the God of your father, has given you this treasure, and that I had your money and we put it back. And, he's telling them the truth. And if you recall, Joseph had even talked about their God and when they left. So He told him, I had the money. I put it back in your sacks. This was a treasure from your God. And, it's God's goodness that has given you this money. And then he brings Simeon out. So now the promise that Joseph made, if they came and they brought Benjamin, that they would get Simeon back, has now been fulfilled. So you'd think maybe they're starting to feel a little better about the situation, right? Well, let's find out in verse 24. And the man brought the men into Joseph's house and gave them water, and they washed their feet, and he gave their asses provender. And they made ready the present against Joseph came at noon, for they heard that they should eat bread there. And when Joseph came home, they brought him the present which was in their hand into the house, and bowed themselves to him to the earth. So things keep getting better. Now he's bringing them water to wash their feet. A very, very common thing. As they traveled about, their feet would be dirty and dusty. And so, to have that opportunity to wash your feet when you come into someone's home. So things are getting good. They were expecting that they were going to be taken and have everything taken from them. But they continue to see kindness. Everything Joseph is having done here is just kindness to them. The love, the goodness is being used to win them over to their full repentance. So the brothers are receiving all this again. They don't know who he is. He is an Egyptian to them. This is, again, a picture of how God shows us love even before we accept him and we show our love back to him. And so we see now that, Joseph comes in, they present their present, and I'm sure the present was not something they were holding in their hand. I'm sure there was a display out on the ground in front of them of all the things that they brought, the spices, the nuts, the honey. And they had it all there, and we see here again, they are bowed down in front of Joseph with their faces to the earth. So we are again reminded of Genesis 37 when Joseph revealed his dreams to his family. So we see that they are honoring the Egyptian official, not only out of respect, but now out of gratitude for all the kindness that's been shown to them. They have Simeon back. They're here to dine with him, and they now feel like that is truly what they're there for. So they're showing respect, they're showing gratitude, but they also, need to show him these things. And so if we move on to verse 27 through 30, and he asked them of their welfare and said, Is your father well, the old man of whom ye spake? Is he yet alive? And they answered, Thy servant our father is in good health, he is yet alive. And they bowed down their heads and made obeisance. And he lifted up his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, Is this your younger brother of whom ye spake unto me? And he said, God be gracious unto thee, my son. And Joseph made haste, for his bowels did yearn upon his brother. And he sought where to weep, and he entered into his chamber, and he wept there. So again, they meet Joseph for the second time, and Joseph shows this unusual concern for their family and for their father. All right? Again, he's an Egyptian to them. But he asks how their father is doing. Is he still alive? Is he well? And again, I'm sure he didn't ask this of every traveler that came into Egypt looking for grain. And so, but then he sees Benjamin, and it's been a very, very long time since he saw Benjamin. He'd been gone for a very long time. Benjamin was a wee lad the last time Joseph saw him. And he saw Benjamin, his only full brother. And again, the second time now that he's with his brothers where he is overcome with emotion, he leaves the chamber looking for a place to cry, to weep. And I'm sure all these emotions that overcome him, things like he doesn't even have a relationship with his brother Benjamin at this point, right? And, the relationship that he had with his other brothers wasn't a good one. So he goes, he weeps, and in verse 31, we find that Joseph, and he washed his face and went out and refrained himself and said, set on bread. And they set on for him by himself, and for them by themselves, and for the Egyptians which did eat with him by themselves, because the Egyptians might not eat bread with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination unto the Egyptians. So Joseph goes, he has his emotional moment alone. You know, he gathers himself, washes his face, and you know, doesn't tell us how long that this took. I am assuming that he did it pretty quickly because he had things to accomplish here yet with his brothers. And so he comes out, and it's now time to eat. Well, this is where things get weird because the Egyptians aren't going to eat with Hebrews. All right, Egyptians looked down looked down on Hebrews. They looked down on shepherds, people that led that lifestyle. So Joseph didn't eat with his brothers. Well, guess Joseph didn't eat with the Egyptians either because the Egyptians knew he was an Egyptian. So Joseph ate by himself. His brothers ate together, and then the Egyptians of the house, they ate separately from them. And so this was because Egypt had a very racially separated society. The first thing is Egypt's believed they came from gods. So they thought they were better than everyone else. And so they did very little mixing with people from foreign lands during Joseph's time. And so everyone else was less, especially Hebrew shepherds. So the Egyptians did not eat with Joseph. Joseph did not eat with his brothers. His brothers did not eat with the Egyptians, these strangers from Canaan. And so, we see, even though Joseph was the number 2 in the land, they still knew he was a Hebrew, and he still did not eat with the Egyptians. So just a few interesting things here as we look at this process, just where, they all ate separately. It is known from, and this is just a few quotes, it is known from Herodotus that Egyptians so abhorred things foreign that priests, at least, ate and drank nothing that was imported, nor would they use utensils for eating that had been used by Greeks. So we see here the wisdom of God. Before we get through Genesis, we're going to see that, the entire family of Jacob is going to be brought into Egypt. And by being brought into Egypt, they're going to be isolated. They're going to be surrounded by Egyptians who are going to look down on them, who are not going to, intermingle with them. And so, once they come into Egypt, they're going to be surrounded by Egyptians for about 400 years where they multiply, increasing the amount of Israelites to very large numbers. And if they had stayed in Canaan, it's probably, they would not, the Israelites would not have stayed as pure because they would have just been assimilated with all the other godless peoples of Canaan. And so God not only had to take the family out of Canaan where they were, out of that corrupt environment, but they had to put them into a place where they would be racially separated and segregated from the people that they were with. So there wouldn't be intermarrying or any of that going on. So, we see all of this was, Joseph was simply just sent ahead to make these arrangements. And we're going to wrap it up here with verses 33 and 34. And they sat before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth. And the men marveled one at another. And he took and sent messes unto them from before him, but Benjamin's mess was 5 times so much as any of theirs, and they drank and were merry with him. All right, so we see here at the end a couple of astonishing things. Joseph gave them all place settings at the table, and it literally went from oldest to youngest. So we have 11 brothers seated, oldest to youngest, from this mystery Egyptian, and they marveled at each other. They were astonished, all right? This is not something that could just happen by chance. The statistic, the odds of this happening, of placing 11 brothers in order of their age, is like 1 in 40 million. So this wasn't just chance, right? So they're looking around and they're like, wait a minute. we're all seated in order. So they were they marveled at this. They were astonished. And then he sent the messes out to them, and the mess was just simply the food and the drink, out to the brothers. And guess who got the most? Benjamin got 5 times the mess that all the rest of the brothers got. So we see a test here, all right? Joseph is putting a test. He wants to see how they react to Benjamin getting the most. I grew up with 3 brothers, and, it was a fight at the dinner table to make sure who got the last scoop of mashed potatoes or anything like that, right? So, you imagine there's 11 of them there, and the little one, baby boy, the lad, got the most. I went down, put him in a headlock, and took mine. But, that's how that goes. But we see this test. He wants to see if they resent the fact that Benjamin, as the favored one, got the most. As we see this here, Joseph continues to look for this change in the heart of his brothers, the ones that sold him into slavery. So he wants to see if they've had a change of heart or if they were still the same men that threw him in a pit, ignored his cries for help, and then sold him into slavery. This could have been the whole motivation in asking for Benjamin, to even see if they would take care of Benjamin on the journey, because he went on a journey with them one time and they didn't take care of him. So, we continue to see this test. So obviously we see tests in our lives, all right? And if we fail in our tests, God makes sure we get, a second chance, opportunities to pass the test again. But it's important that we can rise up to the tests when they come in our lives. So we'll come back next week. We'll see what happens next. I'm sure most of you already know. So I can't really set this up for a cliffhanger as much as I would want to. But we'll come back next week and see what happens here with the meal and the brothers here in Egypt.